Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar, Do We Need Police in Schools? Creating Safety for All Students. The Center for Policing Equity is excited to welcome all of you to this timely discussion about creating safe schools for all students. Let me go here really quickly. Okay. Today, we're going to be hearing from a panel of experts about their experiences advocating for changes to existing school safety systems, and we'll end with a Q&A after our panel discussion. So please submit any questions that you have via the Q&A feature in Zoom. And then, let's get ready to get started. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about what we're doing here at CPE. So our K-12 school safety white paper is our K-12 safety white paper series are resources that address critical public safety issues that typically receive politically motivated or too little attention, which has resulted in patchworked approaches rather than building systems of care that we need for communities. Like other papers in this series, the school safety white paper outlines a holistic vision of safety and detailed steps that communities can take toward that vision, recognizing that it may take a long time for some of these systems to be built. The topic of school safety is one that has continued to fuel reactive solutions to instances of extreme violence. But when we followed the evidence for our paper, we found that whether or not police were stationed in schools or called in to respond to school shootings, it didn't make a huge difference in the severity of the shootings. Communities can revise their school safety policies to help put guardrails in place about when it may be appropriate or not to engage with police. And our new companion resource has guidance to help accomplish this. And we're gonna give you that at the end of the session and email it to you. Our focus today will be not about those rare instances warranting emergency response from police, but about the much more routine situations that police are engaging in with students and what could be done differently to meet those needs. There is little evidence that police make schools safe. In fact, research shows that stationing police in schools increases disciplinary actions and fuels a school to prison pipeline, which disproportionately harms disabled students and students who are Black, Latinx, Indigenous, or LGBTQ+. Public health strategies such as school diversion measures and restorative justice initiatives in response to misbehavior can instead foster young people's development and contribute to a welcoming school climate. That's just to give you the baseline of where we're at as an organization for Center for Policing Equity. That's going to be our kind of conversation is going to center around that. Okay. And now we're going to introduce our wonderful panelists that we're so excited to have here. So first, I'm going to introduce Professor Kristen Henning. She's a nationally recognized advocate, author, trainer, and consultant on the intersection of race and adolescence and the policing of Black youth. She is the Bloom Professor of Law and the director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law, and was previously the lead attorney of the juvenile unit at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia. Chris has been representing children accused of crime for more than 26 years and is the co-founder of a number of initiatives to combat racial injustice in the juvenile and criminal legal systems, including Ambassadors for Racial Justice Program and a racial justice toolkit for youth offenders. Her recent book, The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth, was featured on the front page of the New York Times Book Review and received rave reviews in the Washington Post. The book was awarded the 2022 Media for a Just Society Award by Evident Change and the 2022 Social Justice Advocacy Award from In the Margins Book Awards Committee. Welcome, Professor Henning. Thank you so much for being here. Next, I'm going to introduce Ms. Desiree Mims, Communications Coordinator at the Black Organizing Project. Desiree is a mother and San Leandro native who from a young age recognized her passion and calling to social justice and Black liberatory work. Desiree was personally impacted by school pushout and criminalization of her Blackness from as young as elementary school. And those experiences have led her to organizing work in Oakland and eventually to her becoming a member of the Black Organizing Project in 2016. During her struggling years of dealing with school pushout and expulsion, she found refuge in various artistic outlets, most notably writing. It is with her writing and storytelling of experiences with school pushout and over-policing of Black and Brown youth that she finds healing from her own experiences and aims to help members of her community prevail and positively impact the oppressive systems in this country that create real change despite their circumstances. She has dedicated herself to the work of abolishing school police to disrupt the school to prison pipeline and provide students and community with transformative justice in Oakland and beyond. Welcome, Ms. Mims. We're so glad to have you. And then Dr. Gina Bracey, the Associate Vice President of School and Community Initiatives at the Child Health and Development Institute in Connecticut. Dr. Gina Bracey is an Associate Vice President of the Community Initiatives and Child Health Development Institute. She oversees several school and community-based systems, development activities, and has experience in school-based mental health, juvenile justice, diversion, health equity, and program implementation and evaluation. Currently, she directs several statewide initiatives, including the Connecticut School-Based Diversion Initiative, the Connecting to Care Statewide Systems of Care Initiative, and Project Aware. She co-chairs the statewide Trauma-Informed School Mental Health Task Force and serves on several state-level committees to advance policy and practice on social emotional learning, family and community engagement in schools, health equity, racial justice, and juvenile justice diversion. She earned her PhD in clinical and community psychology in 2010 from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Welcome, Dr. Bracey. And finally, I am Adjoa Quadjo. I am an educator and content strategist at the Center for Policing Equity. I am an educator, a researcher, and advocate committed to educational equity. I've been a teacher, administrator, counselor at secondary schools in Harlem and taught for many years and mentored youth from pre-K to college, from community centers to Girl Scout troops, all the way to young adulthood. I am currently a doctoral candidate at Rutgers University Graduate School of Education, where I study the history of policing, punishment, and surveillance in New York City public schools. And we are all going to touch and agree on a May 2024 hooding and graduation for me. I'm on my way out, God willing, and the creek don't rise. That is what we're planning for as of right now. Thank you so much, and everyone, welcome. We're gonna get started with some questions to help. I'm gonna stop sharing here so we can get our places in order so we can all speak and commune together. So I'm actually gonna start I think with you, Professor Henning. Police have not always been in schools. They've not always been stationed in schools, in public K through 12 schools, and they are not currently stationed at all public schools, but they're widely used in some places. Your research has addressed the history of bringing police into schools. So can you let us know what you found in your research? Why are police stationed in schools originally in the first place?
Thank you so much, Adjoa. Let me just say thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be in space and in conversation with all of you on the screen, many of whom I have read about, know your work, know your projects. And so it's great to be here. And I think that's a wonderful way to start the conversation with the historical background, because I have to confess, as long as I've been doing the work, that until I got serious about researching for The Rage of Innocence, how America criminalizes Black youth, I accepted the often repeated narrative that we have police in schools today because teachers and parents were afraid to send their children back to school after the mass shooting in Columbine, Colorado. But as I read and dug deeper, I realized something that I really should have known, which is that the first police in schools appeared actually in 1939 in Indianapolis in response to the earliest even inkling of a conversation about integrating schools, right? And then fast forward, right, to the civil rights era, to the 50s, and you see that police in schools begin to increase exponentially. And the increase was a direct result of or I should put it this way, the purported claims were that police were being sent to schools to create a safe passage for Black and brown students who were going to integrate schools. But we all know from the iconic photographs, from the historical record, that police far too often became an impediment to meaningful integration of schools. But that's really where the root and the heart of this increase of police in schools. And then if we fast forward to the mid 1990s, we see that in 1994, the federal government launches the Cops in Schools framework. And that is the federal framework that funneled federal dollars into state and local school systems that would indeed agree to hire police in schools. What is so important about that date, there's a couple of things that are really important about that date. First of all, the mid 1994 is 3 years after, right? 3 years after the National Association of School Resource Officers was founded. And so that means in 1991, there were enough police in schools that they were convening conferences, writing a mission statement, having protocols. This is 3 years. We still haven't even gotten to Columbine, right? That's 1994. NASRO has already started in 1991. What else is going on in 1994, the mid 1990s? I bet you everybody on this Zoom could type in the chat, the super predator era. That was the full on straight up attack on Black children, to be quite frank. Black and brown children were claimed to be super predators. The prediction was by the year 2000, Black children, and they were named as such by Professor John DiIulio, who coined the phrase and believed that Black children were going to run amok and rape, maim, and kill all of America by the year 2000. Of course, that never happened. And within a year of his publication of this super predator myth, he had to recant, but the damage was already done. Right. So again, mid 1990s, we've got a federal framework already in place for the presence of police in schools. Now, yes, in 1999, Columbine happens, 8 years after NASRO, the National Association of School Resource Officers, 4 and 5 years after the super predator myth. And what happens? We increase dollars. And let's be clear, the increase of dollars, federal dollars for police in schools, comes from both the Democratic side and the Republican side of the table. Right. And what do we see? More police in schools means more arrest in schools. More arrest in schools means more arrest of Black and brown children. So I love to tell this story because it shows the racialized foundations from the very onset, from the first in Indianapolis, the second in Flint, Michigan, all the way through the civil rights era and into the mid 1990s. And so today we see that all 50 states, have schools with police in them. In 1975, if you want to just draw a quick contrast, in 1975, only 1% of US schools reported having police stationed on campus. By the 2017-18 year, 36% of all elementary schools had police on campus. Elementary schools, right? 67.6% of middle schools had police on campus, and 72% of high schools reported having sworn officers. And this is really important. In 1997, that by number, there were about 9,400 school resource officers. By 2016, right? Less than 20 years later, you've got 27,000 police in schools. And that number is probably very, very low because police operate under so many different titles in the school system. So this count that we get the tallies for, often miss private security guards, neighborhood officers assigned to local police departments, but that roam throughout the various school systems. So all of those are often not counted in the police department. So it's really it's really powerful to see how rapidly we moved, and to understand the racialized foundation. And of course, the studies have shown that that the schools in urban areas serving a predominantly Black and brown population are significantly more likely to have police in schools, and to have them at greater numbers. So just the important foundation.
Thank you so much for that. And I really do have to mute myself because I am an amen corner. So I'm definitely, yes, Delulio, yes. Back and forth. So no, I really appreciate that background for us. That famous line about students who are packing guns instead of lunches, like that kind of fear mongering. So important for us to understand that background in terms of policing in schools. All right, so let's move on to our next question. Thank you so much for that, Professor Henning. So our research has found that while the effect of police in schools in reducing violence is unclear, evidence has clearly shown that police increase discipline arrests, especially for students who are Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and/or LGBTQ. And at the same time, we recognize that some SROs offer valuable services to students who otherwise may not have them. I think even in my own research, the United States spends over $1 billion on school safety, over a billion with a B, on school safety, and policing, surveillance, all of that kind of stuff in schools. What have been you all's observations about the presence of police in schools? And what kind of supports might that $1 billion go to instead? And I'm actually going to start with Dr. Bracy, and then I'll kick it back to you, Professor Henning, and then I would love to round it out with you, Ms. Mims.
Sorry, I had to be quicker on my unmute button. I didn't know I was up first. Thank you so much for that question. That's certainly a big one to dive into. And again, also just want to express gratitude for having us here today and being able to share our experiences and some of the work that we're doing and contribute to this discussion. So your question in terms of what can be done with that money, I mean, there's big business, as you mentioned, in terms of supporting policing in schools and supporting even school security staff, and paying for those types of roles and positions. Professor Henning had mentioned, the response after the Columbine shooting. And for those of you that recall, Connecticut also had a very huge school shooting with Sandy Hook Elementary School. And that was back in 2012, over 10 years ago now. But the year following that, our state also invested very heavily in school resource officers and school security at the tune of $2.3 million was kind of invested into that the following year. And, we're a relatively small state with 169 cities and towns, and each of them has its own school district and local control. But still thinking about that, that's a huge investment, putting that into the state system. And so, in terms of what are the alternatives, one of the alternatives is a program such as what we operate at the Child Health and Development Institute. So our initiative is called the School-Based Diversion Initiative, or SBDI for short. That was developed back in 2008 together with our state agency partners at our judicial branch and Court Support Services Division and our Department of Children and Families. Our role at the Child Health and Development Institute is to serve as the statewide coordinating center of that model and co-developer. But the model really has three primary goals of the initiative, and that's to reduce discretionary arrests, suspensions, and expulsions at the point of the behavior in school, to build knowledge and skills among school teachers, school staff, and school resource officers, or whomever is in the building in that security capacity as well, to recognize and manage behavioral health crises, hopefully preventatively, but also to link to and access community-based services that really can more appropriately address those needs, particularly when you talk about the behavioral health and trauma needs of students. We know that there's significant overlap between kids in the juvenile justice system and kids with behavioral health needs and trauma needs at the tune of 75 to 90% of those kids showing those needs. And so having an opportunity to invest on the earlier end in terms of prevention, early intervention, really what you're doing is kind of changing the adult thinking, kind of shifting the adult thinking to respond to behavior challenges at the point that they happen in the school in an earlier and more productive and effective way that's supportive, that's restorative, also, does hold the kids accountable still. And so there's really a balance there, but in terms of the investment, it's a lot less costly to do things that way, and you're again setting students up for better success, both with behavioral health and well-being, as well as academic success, when you can kind of intervene in that earlier phase. Yeah, I always remember, kind of back when this started, our initiative started again, sort of back in 2008, 2009, we piloted it with three schools and have expanded over time. But one of the things that was brought into kind of our system early on, it was actually Judge Steve Teskey out of Georgia, who's since retired, but his work early on, was very supportive and kind of thoughtful in terms of how do you do this, do this approach. But he like, are we really intervening with kids who scare us, or those kids who make us mad? And is it, when do we need police response, and when do we really need that approach that takes a trauma perspective and really looks at what's happened to this child and what's happening right now, and what's the best way to kind of get at the root of what's causing those behaviors, and also in a way that's restorative, that can then build the community and restore back the community, whether that's the classroom, the school, the community at large, when there has been harm done in a situation where discipline has happened. So, I'm happy to share much more about our program and the outcomes that we found. Quickly, I would say we've gone from those initial 3 schools up to over 73 schools in Connecticut at this point, in 26 of our school districts. We've also worked with some other states. But generally, we reduce court referrals on average about 29% across each particular school, and also have connected over 55% more students to behavioral health services that keep them then out of the criminal justice system. So we work very closely with our mobile crisis services. Again, in Connecticut and many states, those services are supported by other funding, and so again, you're not putting that funding into that system. It's really using the existing resources and support system that's there and that's better built and better trained to actually intervene, de-escalate situation, and appropriately connect students to supports and services in the community that may be better to address their needs. So I'll pause there and turn it over.
We're definitely going to give you more time to talk about your programs in Connecticut. Thank you so much for the idea of trauma-informed approaches and really not relying on police as much. I love that. Thank you so much, Professor Henning.
Yes. And so let me, build upon what Dr. Bracey talked about. And Audra, I heard a couple of things, I think, in your question, one of which is what have we observed in our practice? I'm a criminal defense attorney in addition to being a professor, but I am a youth defense attorney in the District of Columbia representing kids, and have been representing kids for the last 26 years, including many children who have been referred to the court system or arrested and refer to the court system from school. And so part of what I hear in your question is the weighing the value, quote unquote, the purported or alleged, if you will, value of school resource officers against the harms. And I think a couple of things come to mind for me. One is that we are asking school resource officers to meet a need, or to meet needs that are more effectively met in other ways. And in fact, that are only effectively met in other ways. So we are asking very often school police officers to be mentors, to be public safety law enforcement officials, and ambassadors, for law enforcement and civic engagement more generally. That's too much, right? Not even is it too much, it's not the best or even appropriate use of those services. If we want mentors, let's have non-law enforcement mentors for kids in schools, right? If we want kids to be supported and wrapped, let's have programs, trauma-informed programs that Dr. Bracy described, right? If we want to improve sort of civic engagement, how about we have, local leaders come and talk about civic engagement? And then most importantly, this question of safety. Do we need law enforcement officers in schools to ensure safety? That's one of the other things that I think all the research has shown, is that we as a country have just bought into the narrative that the only way to keep our children safe in the community and in schools is through traditional law enforcement methods. And that has got to be disabused. And I'm sure, we'll talk at different points about the research on that. But school, we've seen anecdotally, right? Uvalde, other places, that even Columbine, even the presence of police in schools does not achieve that safety goal. And in fact, police officers, law enforcement officers are more effective in that post-event investigation, right? Not the preventative. And so that we need to, when we talk about remedies later, talk about public health solutions, very much like Dr. Bracy said. But what I really wanted to make sure that folks think about is that as we are thinking about the weighing of whatever value we think school resource officers bring to the school space, we have to weigh that against the cost. And that there are several costs that I think people don't either know or recall. One of them is trauma, that police contacts, police presence in the school space is not without consequence. There has been a growing body of research demonstrating the extraordinary psychological impact that police contact has on children and on adolescents. The research shows that children who live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods, heavily surveilled schools, or who have been the target of significant stops, frisks, searches, and I would include walking in the front door of school, right? That children who've experienced that report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. They become hypervigilant, just meaning that they're always on guard, not trusting police officers. And what we have to understand is that distrust of police officers transfers over to other adult authority figures, teachers, counselors, other folks who are in that school space. And that it's also important to recognize that the trauma occurs not just from being the direct contact or the direct target of that police contact, but also watching, witnessing, right, among friends, family, your classmates. So watching a kid body slammed at your school or by a police officer at school, or even, and this is what's important, hearing about it on the news and on the internet. So you might, Dr. Bracy might be in Connecticut, Desiree, you might be in Oakland, but kids are hearing about it right here in DC. And so that trauma carries over, that vicarious trauma of learning about other kids who have been harmed by the police, whether in school or not. So the impact of George Floyd being killed by a police officer carries over to a child having to then walk into school the next day and see someone in a blue uniform. Real significant, impact. And that we have to weigh that cost against the whatever value can be found in police and schools. And the last thing that I'll say here is, I think another piece that goes completely, well, not completely, but often gets missed is, so we've already talked in this webinar, I think, Ajwa, you set us up with that so many children are being criminalized in school, arrested in their school for normal adolescent behaviors, right? Talking back, playing on cell phones, getting into school fights, things that we don't want our kids to do, but it's a natural part of what it means to be a teenager. And the thing that is so critical is that the criminalization of children during adolescence has such a significant impact on a child's developmental trajectory. And what do I mean by that? That we take for granted that we take play, recreation, and leisure for granted as adults sitting on a webinar like this, but child's opportunity to play, to laugh, to socialize is super critical, even in the school space. And that when we criminalize these normal adolescent behaviors, we are interrupting a developmental necessity. And so, for example, kids joan, everybody knows the language, right? Everybody's joning on each other, right? That's a part of, sort of developing your reputation, your ego, your self-esteem, right? Sometimes at the expense of other kids. I am not advocating for bullying, but people don't recognize the social benefits even of joning with one another. People playing and tussling on a schoolyard, that also is about, in many ways, leadership development, right? Thinking about a child who gets into a fight because he's standing up either for themselves, that's an assertion of their dignity and their self-worth, or getting into a scuffle with another kid who is picking on other younger kids. That's leadership. So I say all of this to say that we often think about adolescent misbehaviors, adolescent antics as all negative. What we don't realize, there is a great deal of research showing that those things that we as adults get annoyed by, right, are actually useful for some of the developmental skills that are essential. So I just wanted to throw that in the mix, because I think we don't think about discipline as interfering with a developmental benefit. It's not only a developmental benefit, it's a developmental necessity. So that's a significant cost of police in schools.
Yes, no, I love that. Thank you so much for that idea of like cost benefits. It's, I think, crucial for policymakers. Also, I'm from DC. So when you said Joan, and I was like, oh, yes, that's all of elementary and middle school and high school also, and life as a teacher. Actually, joning is something you need to really be familiar with. But I want to kick it over to you, Desiree, and just I'm thinking about what Dr. Bracy and what Professor Henning have said, and one of the things that I've realized over time doing this same kind of research area, looking into this, is that a lot of times people will say, well, we need police in school, or a lot of adults actually will say, my school had police and we needed police because my school is dangerous. And I will always say in response, well, you had police and you still characterize your school as dangerous, right? So police didn't necessarily make you feel safe, in totality. To Professor Henning's point, maybe have even interrupted some of those important developmental stages. But same question to you, kind of what have you noticed about police being in schools? And what maybe supports do you think should be used instead of cops?
Yeah, incredible question and answers. I think, Oakland is very unique as far as like our political landscape and our history, thinking about, like the Panther Party. And so as an organizing organization, a lot of our work is around developing community members around their political analysis. And of course, one of the biggest things that we deal with as a community is policing, harsh policing, over policing. And so we always hear overwhelmingly from a community how we feel and how we're impacted by police in general. So it's interesting that the same police who are trained to criminalize, who brutalize our communities, are looked at differently when they're in school campuses. And so the same type of officers that can kneel on somebody's head are then somehow deemed as like acceptable to be around our smallest, most vulnerable children. And so, in Oakland specifically, until our resolution was passed to eliminate Oakland School Police Department, our schools were policed by 3 different policing entities. And so to Ms. Henning's point, even about like the landscape and the experience of being over policed, our students were policed by city police, their own internal force, the school security officers, but they also come from housing police. They get on transit and there's transit police, the same police that killed Oscar Grant. So, that kind of builds the experience that a lot of our students were having. And police, from our experience and mine personally too, I have never felt resourced or supported by officers, but I have seen them create harm also by absorbing and taking up all the resources that our students need. We have schools that have lead in the water. Teachers don't have books. We have so many issues as far as like funding in our schools. And so, then we also had a district that was funding school officers $6 million a school year or more. And so, and at the same time, the disproportionate amount of harm that was happening was, you know, you have a school population of Black students that make up less than 30%, but we're 70% of suspensions, expulsions, arrests. And I think, you know, to your point, I think somebody made a point about like student behavior, right? And so a lot of this is kid behavior, it's normal behavior, but it's only criminalized when it's Black. So I think, yeah, that's the issue too, is like, you know, as a Black organization, we also want to affirm and uplift the anti-Blackness that is rampant through policing in society, in schools in general. In one school year, we had teachers call police 2,666 times in one school year. It resulted in less than 30 arrests. So the huge, vast disproportionality, you know, it's like, so what are we actually relying on police for? And so, you know, that's kind of like been, I forgot to mention too, and I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention, the same police department that we eliminated also claimed the life of a young man named Raheem Brown. And so, you know, we're not just also talking about like harm that's happened in other states. We're talking about real harm that's happened in, you know, in the community on a school campus. And so, you know, I think also when we talk about resources that are needed, I really caution us against relying or even envisioning police as being capable of providing the resources that are needed, because what we deem as crime is, you know, a manifestation of root causes, and it's the root causes that are so often overlooked or neglected, or maybe people don't care. But we're talking about families that are impoverished, that are below the poverty line. They don't have food, they don't have housing. All these things create, you know, what you could imagine might come out as like behavioral issues in schools. And so to only throw police at that is such a disservice, and to see it happen over and over is, you know, it's a real problem. And so for us, we definitely always affirm that funding, resourcing, like that is a priority. Closing schools creates harm in communities. So how can we keep schools open? How can we keep them open with healthy water, with healthy food? You know what I mean? Mental health is a big thing, especially post-COVID, and we have done a horrible job at addressing the impact that that had on students and families. And so there's just so many examples of things that can be funded: restorative justice, transformative justice. And so even when we think about like police officers and how we fund and station them, you know, the number that we heard about how many schools have police in our district, in a district like Oakland Unified, as if we have about like 30 schools or such, and we applaud restorative justice as an example of like what we might be doing right, but we actually only have 10 restorative justice practitioners. And then those people are being called to do other things on school campuses because we're understaffed and underfunded, you know, like that can't be said to be a solution. And so in some of the work that we do, there's so many examples of what would work, but they're not funded. There's so many examples of community-based orgs that exist that already do the work. They're not funded. They're not being contracted. So, you know, again, it's like it's going the easier route, and that's easy for schools, but it's harmful on our communities. It's obstructing justice. There's a statistic that I think about all the time when we think about the school to prison pipeline and police creating that pipeline interaction. And that stat is that nationwide, Black men who don't have a high school degree by the age of 18, 60% of them will go to prison. That stat jumps up to 90% in California specifically. Why, I don't know, but that's a real reality. And so that strong correlation between not having access to education, but having access to prison is stark. So.
Yes. Thank you so much for that. I'm glad I'm muted because I'm like, yes, absolutely, right, exactly, to everything you all are saying. I'm actually going to stay with you, Ms. Mims, for this next question. So you all, the year following the year that you eliminated the Oakland School Police Department for Oakland Unified School District, they made 92% fewer calls to the police than the year before, which is great. Can you tell us about the resources and supports that Oakland put in place to help teachers and students transition to police-free schools? Because I think this is one thing that people are like, huh? Like, how can we do this? Essentially, like, how do you put resources in place, but also kind of work with people's mindset, I guess is the question too.
Yeah, definitely working, shifting the hearts and minds of people is like some of the bigger work. And as an organizing organization, that is like largely our work. But like literally in the implementation process after our resolution was passed, one of the biggest things was making sure that we were co-conveners with the district. So we had decision-making power. We weren't just suggesting, okay, here's our resolution, now we suggest you do this. We actually had a seat at the table, and it was important for us to create the table to bring other community-based orgs and allies who hold very integral part of the work. And so those became the steering committee of implementation. And so some of the first things that we wanted to do, which we did, was create like a police-free guidance, for instance. And so that was like a matrix that we created that directed all school staff on who to call for what reason. Because again, to that stat about those thousands of calls, those weren't all, you know, they shouldn't have gone to police. So if it was a school fight, we're not calling the police for school fights. We're not calling the police for, you know, so many of the reasons that they were. And so we also created like a coordinator of safety who would take all those calls and direct to where they would go. Also, one of the biggest things too, especially around this school resource officer, school security officer aspect, is we had school security officers, and we totally like restructured their department. And so they're no longer called security officers or resource or any officer. We have culture and climate ambassadors, and then culture keepers, and they're kind of like 2-tiered levels. But it was important to, you know, because we want to transform school culture, not just eliminate police. So that was important for their name change. We changed their uniform so they don't have a police emblem. We removed them from carrying around handcuffs. And so those things we've already heard from students have been very impactful, because they're not just replicating what police do, and they're not operating, hopefully, in a punitive manner. So that was really important. We also wanted to make sure that we mitigated any harm after the school police department was eliminated. So we melted down guns, we decommissioned vehicles. You know, so there's a lot of work that has been done. And then kind of the hardest part, aside from funding, is that narrative work, that mindset shift, that racism and implicit bias, anti-Blackness. And so we did a lot of work to create really good trainings that we are pushing to be mandatory, but they're not mandatory. Most schools have, you know, anti-racism trainings, but they're not mandatory, or they're not paid. And so I think that that's, you know, what we're kind of up against. And one element too, which we uplift, which I haven't heard too much when we talk about this conversation, is cultural competency too. So our district sometimes is used as like a test district for a lot of teachers to come. They educate for 1 to 2 years, and then they move on, you know what I mean? And they get their chops here. And so these are teachers that are coming from communities that aren't like Oakland and aren't like our community. And so that misunderstanding, that missing link between them just being kids, you guys say joning, but I think we say roasting. So kids being kids, right? And roasting each other and playing around and beatboxing on the table. Like, these are things that are normal to a lot of us and might literally be criminal to teachers or to people who just don't understand. And so that's an important part that we can't leave out, is like, how are we actually connecting with students? How are we building relationships with students? How are we understanding students? And so we're really pushing for the training to be mandatory, and then also creating a pipeline for community members to be school staff, to be liaisons, to be the people on school campus. You know what I mean? Because there's too many people here who have the lived experience, who have the understanding, and they just don't have an opportunity to engage with the school in a meaningful way.
I love that. Yes, that's wonderful. The kind of like using the resources that you already have in the community to help cultivate safety in a place. I love that. Okay, we're going to move from California to Connecticut. Back to you, Dr. Bracy. The school-based diversion initiative that you spoke a little bit about earlier has helped change the response to students' mental health crises from punishment to support, which we've just been talking about. From 2010 to 2019, on average, participating schools reduced referrals to the courts by 29%. We love that. And increased referrals to the mobile crisis service by 55%. We love that. Can you tell us about how and why this program was developed specifically around mental health services for students?
Yes, absolutely. We love to share that information. And it's so much of this syncs up with what Ms. Mims was just saying. I mean, we've certainly looked at Oakland Unified and the work that's been doing in the larger Oakland community for years as leaders in this area. So it's great to just be in the same space as you. So I'll try not to duplicate what you've said, but with our SPDI model in particular, again, it was really developed to kind of address how to better intervene and talking about training and the importance of training for school staff, the importance of professional development. And yeah, it's hard to make it mandatory for us as well, but doing what we can to get that embedded in. It looks like my signal might be unstable, so hopefully you can hear me okay. A little bit of challenge. Give me a signal if you, visual signal if I need to stop or come back. But yeah, so training is a huge component of the model. Doing, again, kind of doing this work preventatively, so we don't have to deal with the punishment end of things, right? So how can we do things much more earlier intervention? Are we identifying kids' needs? Are we engaging students, building positive relationships with them, and helping from that aspect? So building that positive school climate that you talked about as being so important, transforming the school climate so that it can be more positive and supportive and equitable, which is a key component of this as well. And then integrating, again, restorative practices, kind of graduated response models of discipline intervention. So kind of working with those lowest level behaviors first before it escalates and before, clearly identifying whose role is it to intervene at what level. And also, again, using our partners. So we talked about mobile crisis. Positive youth development came up, youth service bureaus in the community that, often what we got when we first developed this model and this response was like, okay, don't arrest, don't suspend, don't expel. What do we do instead? Like if the behaviors are still there, then what do we do instead? And so a lot of that is, again, connecting to those other supports, building up those positive youth behaviors and the supportive practices, things that everybody doesn't need a behavioral health response necessarily either. So we're not saying that the goal is not just take them out of the juvenile justice system and put them in the behavioral health system, but it is identifying what are the appropriate needs, what are the appropriate services and supports, which may, again, somebody mentioned be mentoring, and maybe positive support, relationship with somebody in the building that's not the police officer. What kinds of things do we have already, resources that we can promote and improve? And so again, the issue of, we talked about restorative practices a little bit, and that's by nature an indigenous practice, right? And so building that up and kind of really emphasizing the community, the school as a community and everybody's role within that. So again, kind of just framing with where are the positive aspects of this? How do we do it from that perspective? The shift in culture, I think, again, was a really important piece. One way that we help kind of solidify that too is through memorandum of agreement. So with the police department, if the police department is in the district and our organization's not necessarily in a position of advocating for or against removal of police in the schools, we kind of have to work with schools where they are when they come into our model. So if they have police officers, we do our best to clearly identify in writing what is the role of that response. How do we make that the last resort? Unless we can identify a positive activity at the beginning in terms of support, but how do we make that a last resort? What are we putting in place before then? What are all the steps that go into addressing a behavior challenge when it happens? Who else is involved? How are we engaging the family? What supports are there for teachers? We talk about the challenges that teachers are facing right now too, in terms of they're overwhelmed, they're traumatized, they're experiencing vicarious trauma, they are understaffed and undersupported. And so there's a lot put on them as well. So to not have to deal with the screaming child or a tantrum or somebody, causing harm to someone else or a fight, clearly we don't necessarily want them to have to deal with those issues either. But it's like, again, how do we build those supports through training, through support, clearly identifying a process? So putting it down on paper, creating a flow chart, who responds when, how does that happen? How are we best maximizing resources that we already have? And, I think that model has worked very well for us. I mean, we've had a lot of positive response to our school-based diversion initiative. We've had great outcomes. I mean, even the the stat that you mentioned in terms of court referrals. So that is one clean set of data that we can get in Connecticut, is from the Court Support Services Division in terms of how many kids actually make it to court processing. There's a lot of levels of data before that, of course, in terms of how many kids are sent to the office, how many times are police called, how many kids, times do police respond. But teasing those apart to each level, and also looking at particularly the demographics of that and where the disparities are, because that is a pervasive issue, even in Connecticut, which many people don't realize our level, how much diversity we have in Connecticut as well. But unfortunately, we have a lot of disparities, just like those that you all are mentioning, and that nationally have been a problem. So again, kind of putting all of those pieces together, looking at data, monitoring data across the way to kind of align that with positive outcomes, and making sure that these efforts are successful is really important as well. And, as I said, we've kind of grown that model from its humble beginnings back in 2008. And what's really been important in that too is having statewide support. So it was probably about 7 years into the initiative that we were able to get it embedded into the governor's biennial budget. And so now it's state funded. It has sustainable funding every 2 years in the budget, or since that time at least. It's been renewed. And so that gives an opportunity to kind of say, the investment is here, let's use it, let's expand it, let's continue to help other students benefit from it.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And also that piece about essentially how you can get like buy-in from elected officials. Data is one of those pieces, for example. We're going to move to our Q&A section. And there are questions in the Q&A segment. If you all see any of those that you want to take, you can answer in the chat, and I'm going to voice over some that we see that I think could be beneficial for lots of folks. So here's a question. So for a long time, I have been struggling with counteracting the narrative that many folks, mostly white, buy into, that more police make us more safe. And we addressed this a little bit earlier. This propaganda triggers people's fear. Any ideas of positive narratives and messaging that help people turn off their fears and be willing to invest in the other resources that would meet our societal needs, rather than investing in huge police budgets? I'm going to actually start kicking it back over to you, Professor Henning, and then swing back down to Ms. Mims and then Dr. Bracey, if you want to take it in that order.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think honestly, well, so I think there's two things in there. One, it's the narrative of fear, and just as Ms. Mims said, there is the anti-Blackness, right? The narrative is about Black kids and about brown kids, right, being a danger. And so that is the work, and that is the hardest part of the work, is shifting that narrative so that we don't make the same mistakes of the super predator era. And I always say, to folks that the best way to start breaking that narrative is getting proximate. It's having the folks who you are talking to. I saw that question as well from Des Moines, creating space and opportunity for folks who are making critical decisions, folks who have those fears, to get proximate to those young, Black and brown children, to see all of their joy and promise and, intelligence and value and worth. And what I mean by, getting proximate, it's folks should not be making decisions and being afraid of kids that they won't meet at a park, that they won't meet, by volunteering, whatever, at a local recreation center, a local church, tutoring some kids. That's the way to break the narrative, one person at a time. That's one thing. But I also think that we need an education campaign on a couple of different levels. And one of the education campaigns is kids are kids. People, but we as a society tolerate and in fact find humor in adolescence, right? Like, we glorify those adolescent years on Hollywood big screen. It's funny, all the antics. But when it comes to Black kids and brown kids doing the exact same things that we've been talking about on this call, it is problematized as a crime. So I think part of the education campaign has got to be reminding folks that adolescent development looks like adolescence all over the world, not just in the United States, that the scientists have discovered that the key features of adolescence, impulsivity, peer influence, all of these things, failure to think ahead to the long-term consequences, all of that, short-term rewards, they're evident all over the world. And so Black and brown children are no different than white children. And so a part of my work has been around storytelling, right? Even, sort of writing about the criminalization about Black kids has been an effort to tell stories that get readers to see themselves in those stories. Oh, wow, I did that when I was 15 and I didn't get arrested. Oh, my own child did that last week, and I would have been appalled if they got arrested. So helping people see the similarities, not even the similarities, the identical, behaviors. And then the final thing I'll say about the education campaign is a lot of what I think, Dr. Bracy and Ms. Mims have already talked about is educating folks on what works. I think we as a society, we talked about this earlier, have bought into the narrative that police are the only way to keep us safe because nobody has taught us anything differently, right? So if you give me, if you only give me a hammer, I'm gonna, beat everything to death. But if you give me trauma-informed services, if you give me, social emotional learning, if you give me a mobile crisis lab, if you give me, all of these things, then I want those instead. And I should tell you all that when they have done public opinion surveys, and you educate people before they take the public opinion survey, people agree that it's more humane to try the rehabilitative responses. But what happens is we don't teach people about the rehabilitative responses. Our city leaders don't fund them adequately or meaningfully. They might fund them for 2 weeks, and then something major happens in the city. See, that was a terrible idea. And they withdraw all the money, right? Instead of like tweaking it for the neighborhood or what have you. So I feel like, for folks who are still learning, we need, one-page infographics on alternatives to law enforcement. We need one-page infographics that we can circulate about the harms of police contact. We need, one-page infographics, if you will, or community meetings, town halls that literally educate folks on the alternatives to traditional law enforcement, in addition to some work around getting the decision makers in proximity with the young people.
Thank you so much for that. That was great. I'm here snapping and clapping. Yes. Ms. Mims, do you have any ideas about this too? How do we counteract narratives and get people on board?
Yeah, so much of what I was thinking was just said too, so eloquently, but I would also just, urge us to have, we hear this, and I don't want it to be a cliche, but have those difficult conversations. And that is having conversations with people that, are not like-minded or who might view you a certain way or your community. But I think, that proximity, that part is really important. One thing that was successful for us, at least as far as school police in particular, was creating a docu-series around some of our youth. We also did one for parents too, student voices, parent voices on their experiences. And so that kind of helped create, it kind of helped to create, a magnifying glass on not what you might think happens, but what literally happens. And when you hear stories of students who, or hear from people now who are incarcerated, and it started with throwing something in the lunchroom at 12 years old, that there kind of really helps to shift people's minds and understand, because again, it's not anything that's particular to Black and brown students. It's things that all students do. And so I've seen before a really interesting exercise where certain behaviors or things that were criminalized by Black and brown students, if you had those up there and you assumed what might be the outcome of doing some of these things in schools, and pose that to people who might be white or Asian or, from affluent communities, and then show them the reality of no, actually, this student was incarcerated in a youth camp for 2 years because of an incident like this. I think examples that create that contrast are really important. Conversations, really just having conversations, and then also doing the work within our community to advocate for the resources that are needed, because I think at the same time that other piece is being done, if we're also increasing the investment and the intentionality around the things that actually do create safety, I think only naturally we would see, you know, the use and the need for police go down, because crime would be going down, because the divestment wouldn't be there anymore. And so that's just, you know, a real example of like, let's actually dare to reimagine how we envision safety. Let's try it for a year or two. Let's try to put funds here rather than there. And I think we would naturally be able to see, you know, but it takes bravery and it takes courage. And so that courage often, unfortunately, only comes right after an incident like a police killing, or like, you know, somebody being body slammed in a school campus. So I think sometimes it's reminding folks of like, this is our daily reality. This is some people's daily reality. So you see it when it's on CNN, and then you're here with us, and then you come to the table. But this might be a reality for people every single day. So.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Dr. Bracey, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said already. And, you know, I think two things come to mind for me as well. One is making it a public health issue. So if you can frame it as a public health issue that impacts everybody, then you can kind of shift that lens a little bit and say, you know, this is going to impact you, and it impacts you in this way. By not responding, you know, by not doing it this way, here's how the trickle down effects of that. One of those really specific ways is around costs, and, you know, how much money can be saved, taxpayer money, how much money can be saved by taking a different approach, right? And investing in the different alternative options. So we know that, you know, students arrested are at least twice as likely not to graduate, and 4 times, if not more likely, not to graduate if they're processed through the court. And so what are the collateral consequences of that over the lifetime, right? And so thinking about, you know, once they're in the system, the cost of housing a person in the system, first of all, either in juvenile detention or in adult jail or prison, are astronomical. And then, you know, in terms of how their productivity in society and ability to, you know, to go on that other pathway, not having those examples or those situations impact them is a huge difference. And so again, I guess kind of that personal approach, but also thinking about cost. And then for us, you know, it's really about data. So framing, a lot of times it's giving the numbers and breaking it down in a way that makes a really compelling story. So, you know, a lot of times you'll get maybe the actual, like just a set number of here's how many arrests there were, or here's how many kids were impacted. But looking at that as a proportion, particularly in terms of how many school-based arrests are there compared to the overall juvenile arrests or the overall community-based arrests, it's a relatively small percentage. I mean, relatively, it's, you know, but you know, what and then breaking that down even further, what were those arrests for? Are they, again, those kind of common school rule violations that really should not involve police and, you know, have police involvement, or not necessarily criminal behavior? Or is it things that warrants that? And then, you know, looking at that even more, drilling down into that, most of school-based arrests are for breach of peace, or things like threatening, very minor responses. And so again, what is the trade-off of intervening with those in a different way, or preventing those in a different way, and looking at the proportionally, and also, again, of course, looking at those broken down in terms of disparities and what does it look like for different categories.
Thank you. That was superb. There are lots of questions that are kind of similar in this like idea about narrative. There's one, I'm gonna ask this question. It's from Claudia Silva in the chat, because I think this one is like kind of a biggie. In Texas, schools are now required to have armed security and police in every school. What can local districts do if they want to take a restorative approach while still following the state requirements? So essentially, they won't necessarily be able to get rid of the officer or officers, but what can they do to rely on these people less? Claudia, I definitely revamped your question, but that's what I want to put to the panelists. And I actually want to start with Ms. Mims on this one, since this is part of the work you all were doing in Oakland.
Yeah, that's definitely tough to move around if they are required. But I think if you guys can somehow create or, you know, hold a stake in the hiring of the individuals. So I think that would be really important to assess, especially if we're talking about security. You know, there's various security companies. Often you can do really good research to see like, well, what kind of ideology do they hold and practice anyway? And kind of, you know, filtering out through that process. Sometimes, because we've been in similar situations with hiring, is like, what are the requirements and can we look through community pools and see if there's community members that might be able to come into that position and be trained to do so. Because, you know, hopefully getting somebody in that position or in those positions who hold your same ideology around school culture would be best. And then I think this thing around training, mandatory anti-racism training, implicit bias training, history of policing training and harms of community of color, like those things should be mandatory. Early childhood development, you know, like we're talking, you're around children, you're dealing with children. So the fact that those types of trainings are not required is what creates an even scarier situation, because they have jurisdiction around your students and they don't have an understanding and a good grasp on student behavior often. So I think if you guys can advocate for being somehow, I don't know if it's a community organization, if it's a parent or student association, school board, but advocating to be part and co-conveners in the process of the hiring, and then creating training that you can make mandatory, hopefully, or even maybe organizing those individuals to be compelled to take the training, even if it's not mandatory. I think the people power might come in, you know, in that realm. I hope that helps.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think those were great answers. Excellent stuff. Especially the piece about the hiring. I would just add to that, like asking what the MOU looks like, right? So just because you have to have officers on site, can there be a memorandum of understanding? Let's say just with the teachers, when is it appropriate to reach out to that officer, or when is it not? Like, and it goes to, I know you mentioned Dr., or former Judge Teskey, what are the youth offense protocols? Like, so what are the steps? What are the things that must happen before one, calls or relies on an officer on site? Also, I think some of the things that Ms. Mims said earlier about, like, how do the officers show up? Just because you have to be an armed officer, can you show up like, in plain clothes? What does it mean to be hired by the school system? Can you be physically off campus, like literally down the block, in proximity, and still on the quote unquote payroll of the school board, but yet not literally physically in the building, increasing trauma, right? So things like that. I would say I love your ideas also, Ms. Mims, about organizing, also creating space for young people to sit at the table and talk about, well, if we had a school offense protocol, or if we had an MOU regarding when police engagement is appropriate, can those young people be at the table and discuss their harms? So all of the stuff that you talked about with regard to training, all the anti-racist training, and also just straight up adolescent development training, right? About kids will be kids, training on, what they call it, on policing the teen brain. So just adding to what you said, which I thought was phenomenal stuff.
You just made me think of something really quick. I think is important also, which is one of the things we did, was we created also a complaint policy in addition to an MOU. And that also helped not only create a pipeline for people to voice, like real interactions and harm that they were experiencing, but we also use that as an assessment tool. Because I think if you guys can do something like that and you see 2 years down the line or even a year that they actually were not creating any safer, environment, I think that that's a really important, powerful tool that you guys can use to organize against that as well.
No, that was wonderful. I wasn't sure if you were coming off mute, Dr. Bracy, but that was really, really wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we've got time for about one more. I'm so sorry if I do not get to yours, if yours was not the one that I asked. So some of these are now super long. Oh yeah. Okay. We'll send a follow-up email. Some of these questions are just about resources and things later on, which I'm trying to catch. But okay, so This is from Stephanie Kamey. Are there any talking points to convince parents and teachers who are Black and brown who understand the harm of police, but cannot actively disengage with SROs, especially when they're kind of the only behavioral backup for them? Are there any talking points or advice that you all can give them? I think that's a great question, because a lot of the, no, my school was dangerous, we needed cops, are from Black and brown folks that I hear. So I think that's actually a really great question. Any of you can take it. Maybe we'll actually start with you, Dr. Bracy. Do you have any talking points that you want to give to people who are like, this is kind of what we have? How can we do something else? I feel like in Connecticut, you guys have done a good job of reducing the school police footprint.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of specific talking points off the top of my head. I can tell you a little bit about our process and kind of how we get to that, and we do try to individualize that really with each school that we work with. So one of the things we do to engage youth and families is our community conversations, and so we have those, with each school community to have them come in, what's working well, what's not working so well, what are some strategies for change, and kind of hearing from them to begin with in terms of, their perspective and response. And sometimes it's also kind of, I think there was a question in there too, or sometimes it's the teachers themselves that are asking for more law enforcement involvement that rather than less. And sometimes there are parents that are asking for a harsher, punishment or response, at least in a particular situation, than what we were calling for. And so a lot of times it's educating about, why are we taking this approach? What does it mean? What are you going to see that's going to look differently? What are you concerned about? And helping address those in that way. And I think just being very transparent and communicative from the beginning is really helpful in that, and making sure that all those voices are engaged. So we also, do our work through a school-based work group, so they can, of school staff, a school team has to be identified. So it's not one point person who knows about this work and is kind of getting it through the school. It's really an involved team around. Everybody has a responsibility in this. And so we need everybody to be, supporting it and on the same page. And when there are questions or concerns, let's bring them up, let's address them and figure out how to best attack this together. So, I don't know that I'm not like thinking of specific wording as an right now or an example, but it's really kind of that process to get at what's going to make sense for that particular community, and it does change a lot of times depending on what the situation is, what they've experienced before, why they are in the place where they are currently, and what they're really looking to change. And so using their needs and their examples, it has been most effective for us. Okay.
No, thank you so much for that. That's actually such a crucial point, because schooling is done here at the local level. So it actually really is dependent upon the arguments people are making to you, what arguments you respond with, what data you respond with, all of that. It's really, really important. We're just at about time. I'm going to reply to some of the other questions in the chat if we can. And if we didn't get to it, I'm so sorry. Please reach out to us on our social media channels anywhere, so we can get back to you if there's some organizing and real questions you want to ask about the work you're doing. I would like to wrap up with this though, and I'm going to give you all some thinking time because I didn't spin this to you before. I'm stealing this tactic from the Institute for Anti-Racist Education, Ashley Lipscomb. Thank you so much for this. Robin D.G. Kelly, in his book Freedom Dreams, he talks about how we need new visions of things. Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. And so what I'd like to ask each of the panelists, and I'll go first to give you a little bit of thinking time, what is it you see as an ideal school environment where all children feel safe? What does it look like? What are those characteristics? How do we imagine those places? And it doesn't have to be super broad. It can be one or two things. What do you see when you go inside that building? What do students say about it when they leave at the end of the day? And I think this is a really important exercise for all of us to do. And so I'll give you all a little bit of time. I'm going to answer, and then I'm going to go Ms. Mims, Dr. Bracy, and then we'll finish with Professor Henning. But one of the things I think of when I think of what creates a safe school for children is a place for all children, is a place where kids, especially Black and brown kids, they can take a risk, they can fail, They can advocate for themselves, and it's not a life determination on them, right? They can make a mistake. They can get into a fight. They can damage property in the building. They can fail a class. They can talk back to a teacher, and that this isn't some thing that alters their life trajectory. Safe schools are places in my mind where kids can take risks, they can fail, they can advocate for themselves, and those things are seen as normal, they're respected, and they're met with compassion. That's what it is for me in my mind. Lots of steps for us to get there, but it is an important goal I think we should all have when thinking about safety for students. Ms. Mims, what do you say?
I love this question. I envision schools that are colorful, that are colored with art, not prison and jail colors, more outside time, gardens, quality food, no police, counselors, community members, like people who replicate people in students' own lives, like mamas and papas and uncles and and I also think even the way that we choose to educate in our education model, I would like to see that transformed and, actually identify like innate, abilities and gifts and stuff that students have and what they're naturally gravitating to, and then fostering that. And then, meditation, yoga, all the things that I think that when we become adult, we realize like, oh, those actually help restore my spirit and bring some of my childhood back. If we can give children that early on, I think that we could transform communities in general. So.
Yes, agreed. This is a wonderful question and gets me out of my comfort zone a little, I think, in logic models and spreadsheets. So, my first thought is actually to, the multi-tiered systems of support pyramid in many ways. And, our approach to this work is really going beyond those three typical levels of, tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 is grounding that in 2 additional levels. And our first, like the really bottom level, is school, family, community partnerships. And for me, what that looks like, in terms of your question, is that every child sees themselves in their school and they see that as part of their community, and that all of that is reflected within that setting, and that there is a sense of belonging, and that there's not so much artificial walls between this is the school and this is everything that surrounds it, but it's part of the community. And then the next level up is really staff wellness, which is another piece. So we focus so much on the kids and, their needs and educating them, which obviously is the mission of schools, but without having that healthy workforce and support for staff so that they also feel empowered and feel supported, and have that grounding, everything built above it just crumbles. And so I think those are the 2 things I would say.
So I have to say, I love, 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 love. Can I do my little heart? Love, love all of these answers. I want to go to all of these schools. And so maybe I'll just, because I totally agree, I will pull it together and say this, which is that a psychologist friend once said to me something that I have never forgotten, which is that every single child deserves at least one irrationally caring adult in their lives. Really, all the things that have already been said, that we're going to make mistakes as kids, and, nobody's going to shame you, embarrass you, put you under the jail, cart you out and embarrass you in front of your friends and family. But instead, I'm going to be that irrationally caring adult. I'm going to stick with you. Yes, I will redirect you and, give you some better advice, but I'm never going to stop loving you and supporting you. And so that's what I want. It's a school full of irrationally caring adults who cultivate meaningful, phenomenal relationships between children and adults who love them. So that's mine.
I love that. Thank you all so much for answering that. It was as inspiring as I wanted it to be. And so I also just want to say thank you all so much for coming, because now I'm still reeling off of that. I'm like, yes. Irrational adults. Okay, so we want to thank everyone for coming. We appreciate your being here. Please see the chat for important resources for police-free schools and school safety. Check out our newest resource from our Community Up, our community-centered program designed to support community members interested in building equitable public safety systems that can exist beyond the burden of trauma and racist policing. Do we need police in schools? Community resource guide. Some of the questions in there will be answered in that guide. It will really help you all. Please check it out. That provides readers with information about when police involvement is and isn't appropriate in schools, students' rights when interacting with police, and alternatives to police involvement. And you heard some great examples of how to achieve that in your own districts. Engage community members like you make our work possible. Please take a moment to fill out our online survey so we can plan future events on the topics you care about. Maybe you want a part 2 of this, I don't know. You'll also be receiving a follow-up email with links to some of the resources. Somebody asked for contact information for our speakers, all of that stuff. And we talked what we talked about here today, like what's in our white paper, recommendation briefs, and community guide. All of that stuff will be linked in the email. Keep an eye on your inbox for that. And please, as always, like, follow, subscribe, comment, share, save at Policing Equity on all our social media channels. Thank you all so much for coming, teachers, admin, students, policymakers, community members, parents, everybody. Thank you so much for participating in this panel today. And thank you again to all of our lovely panelists. That was wonderful. Thanks so much, you all.